A new Wordle puzzle is online. Click on the link to play.
Listening to the following video may give you clues. Please like and share the videos.
Protesters harass federal NDP leader Jagmeet Singh during visit to Peterborough. A small group of protesters have been hurling abuse and inappropriate language at the federal NDP leader while he visited the campaign office of Gen Dec in downtown Peterborough.
Conservative leader Erin O'Toole has condemned the harassment, while NDP leader Jagmeet Singh says he handled it with grace. Anti-vaccination protesters have honked their horns incessantly.
The blaring horns of anti-vaccine protesters have caused major roadblocks in downtown Ottawa. Police have warned motorists to avoid the area.
Although politicians are not scheduled to return to the legislature chamber until next month, NDP leader Jagmeet Singh says it is a crisis and is demanding an emergency debate in Parliament. He also says he would like to see Prime Minister Justin Trudeau meet with municipal leaders to resolve the situation.
Protesters have been blaring their horns since a convoy of trucks entered Ottawa in late January to lay siege to the federal building. The convoy was led by far-right figures promoting anti-Semitic views.
The convoy marched through Ottawa on January 29, and some have pledged to stay until the COVID-19 vaccination ban is lifted. During the emergency debate, Canadian Public Safety Minister Marco Mendicino said that the federal government had approved the request to beef up our CMP resources to deal with the protests.
He also said hundreds of charges would be laid against the truckers outside Parliament. Despite the fact that the protesters have been honking their horns, Trudeau said the government is committed to dealing with the issue.
The lawsuit filed by an Ottawa resident has a similar outcome. A judge has issued an injunction limiting the truckers from honking their horns for 10 days.
If the injunction is violated, violators could face contempt charges, a more serious penalty than a regular bylaw violation. In addition to the lawsuit filed by local residents, the Ontario Superior Court has granted an injunction to prohibit the convoy from honking their horns in downtown Ottawa.
However, the judge did note that honking a horn does not reflect great thought. The judge cited an example of a protester honking a horn in a court of law.
Conservative leader Erin O'Toole condemns protests. Recent polls suggest that the Conservatives are losing ground to the Liberals in the general election.
According to the Angus Reid Institute, Trudeau has a higher approval rating among Conservatives than Singh does. The poll also shows that O'Toole is perceived favorably by fewer Conservatives than either Singh or Trudeau, but she's still lagging behind the NDP and Liberals.
Despite this rebuke, the opposition is attempting to use the issue of vaccinations to divide Canadians. Conservative leader Erin O'Toole says the government should consider the concerns of truckers and work toward solutions.
Meanwhile, Trudeau has repeatedly used the issue of vaccines as a political wedge. She says the Liberals are trying to increase vaccination rates by any means necessary while hurting the supply chain and driving inflation up.
The Liberals have been dealing with anti-vaxxer protesters during their campaign tour across the country. On August
15, Justin Trudeau cancelled an event in Bolton, after protesters demonstrated against a mandatory vaccine. The Liberal campaign also has been faced with similar protests and has had to cancel many of its events over safety concerns.
As a result, O'Toole has lost the support of her caucus and a majority of her MPs. Those MPs who have not decided to vote for O'Toole are likely to vote for the NDP's next leader.
The next round of voting will be interesting to see how they respond. If they keep this up, she may win the leadership.
The Conservative Party has condemned the protests after a woman posted a series of tweets alleging that Myers put his hand in her skirt. Myers plans to challenge the statements, and has apologized for the unjust incident.
A statement from the Conservative Party's chairwoman is expected soon. This is just the latest in a string of protests since the NDP and Liberal parties have not fully recovered from the violence.
While the Liberal caucus has met this week, MPs will reconvene on Monday for a winter sitting. They're likely to discuss the Omicron-driven pandemic, rising inflation, and pharmacare.
They'll also be meeting with the Crown Prince of Kuwait. Meanwhile, a trio of Tories holds a press conference on the cost of living crisis and inflation.
In addition, former central banker Mark Carney speaks at the National Association of Business Economics on Energy and Climate Change. NDP leader Jagmeet Singh says he handled harassment with grace.
On Monday, NDP leader Jagmeet Singh said he received a barrage of aggressive verbal harassment while campaigning in Peterborough, on his way to a rally for his provincial party candidate. Protesters threw rocks and gave Singh the finger during the incident, which was captured on video.
In response to the harassment, Singh defended himself by saying, "I handled it with grace." Police in Peterborough are investigating a recent incident in which the NDP leader was harassed while campaigning for Ontario NDP candidate Jen Deck.
Police say Jagmeet Singh, who was unfazed by the verbal abuse, handled the harassment with grace. Peterborough Police Superintendent Craig Farquharson told CBC News the investigation was being conducted after a public complaint.
Jagmeet Singh released a statement following the incident. The criticism has been mixed for Singh's leadership so far.
However, Singh has garnered a large amount of praise for sticking to traditional NDP values and promoting a people-first agenda. He is also credited with pushing for increased spending and higher taxes on the wealthy.
Despite the criticism, Singh has proven to be a forceful speaker in the House of Commons. He has vowed never to let Trudeau bury the NDP again.
While the Prime Minister's testimony was that the decision was made by the civil service, opposition members have been able to find ministerial fingerprints on the sole source contract. The opposition has seen that the documents show the Prime Minister endorsed the deal, while the opposition points out that blacked-out pages are evidence of the Prime Minister's decision.
Holding the government to account must be done with precision and a deadline. However, it's worth remembering that the NDP has steadfastly refused to bring down the government without a national recovery plan.
If it is unwilling to act in good faith, it is time to return to constructive civility in Ottawa while the Liberals and Conservatives are tied in a narrow three-way race. The NDP has a stronghold on a large part of the decided electorate in PQ.
With a slight lead in the polls, the NDP now holds 25 seats and the Bloc Québécois gained 1 seat. The Greens elected 3 members of parliament in BC, including Annamie Paul in Toronto Centre.
Promises to double funding for public transit. Federal NDP leader Jagmeet Singh was targeted by protesters during a recent visit to Peterborough, to campaign for his local colleague Jen Deck.
During the visit, Singh was greeted by a large crowd of angry protesters who shouted obscenities and hurled insults. The incident was caught on video and widely circulated on social media.
After the incident, Peterborough police addressed the situation, calling it disheartening, but adding that they did not receive any calls for service. Ontario NDP leader Andrea Horwath said Singh handled the hatred with grace.
On the other hand, PC candidate Dave Smith has responded by inviting Singh and his family to a barbecue. A protester in Peterborough called for Singh's death, but he did not identify him by name.
The opposition has accused Jagmeet Singh of being anti-government and anti-vigilant. Protesters have also attacked him on social media, causing him to suspend his visit.
Despite the attacks, he remains undeterred and continues to campaign for a seat in Parliament. So what happened? The protesters were shouting and yelling during his visit to Peterborough.
Despite the raucous protests, the federal NDP leader has not made a public apology for the harassment. Earlier, the NDP leader was scheduled to hold a fundraiser for Justin Trudeau in Bolton, Ont.
However, the crowd was not appreciative of the event and protesters turned violent and subsequently forced the cancellation of the rally. In an effort to deter protesters, the federal New Democrats and Liberals have pledged to criminalize those who block hospitals and healthcare workers.
The party leaders have also pledged to toughen up penalties for protesters who block hospital access and harass doctors. They say that the criminal code already protects doctors and justice system staff, but it should also cover physicians.
Despite these pledges, the situation in Toronto remains tense. In the end, the Government of Canada has promised to support the Ottawa Police.
Marco Mendicino, Canada's Minister of Public Safety, commended police efforts. However, this did not prevent protesters from erecting temporary structures on residential streets, causing disruption to the daily life of residents.